Chapter 1. The Garden Fate and the Lost Hour. It was the sort of day that might have been conjured by memory itself, golden and drowsy, with the sun diffused through a filmy haze, illuminating every leaf and petal as if St. Mary Mead were a painting caught between the hours. The vicarage lawns, so often the stage for childhood games and charity raffles, were transformed that Saturday into a small paradise of bunting, flowers, and the hum of villagers gathered for the annual fete. Children raced over the grass, ribbons flying behind them like bright dragonflies. The scent of crushed mint and marigold floated on the breeze, mingling with the yeasty promise of home-baked bread and the sharp tang of lemonade. Here and there, tables, draped in white linen and topped with lacy doilies, bore the bounty of weeks' secretive kitchen labor, rhubarb jams, honey cakes, scones still warm at their heart, and trifles decorated with candied violets. Miss Marple sat slightly apart, her chair positioned beneath a spreading sycamore with a clear view of both the crowd and the vicarage itself. She looked, to the casual eye, perfectly placid, a silver-haired lady in a pale blue dress with a delicate cameo at her throat and a sun hat adorned with faded violets. But her blue eyes, so often described as bird-like or gentle, missed nothing. It was a gift, she liked to think, for noticing the little things. She watched as Mrs. Vickers, plump and pink-faced, led her granddaughter through the cake stall, pausing to chat with Mrs. Bartlett, who always seemed to have a secret to share. There was a certain choreography to these gatherings, Miss Marple reflected, the way people drifted from group to group, exchanging news and observations, each snippet of gossip or compliment folded into the collective memory of the village. "Did you hear, Ethel?" Mrs. Vickers was saying, her voice rich with anticipation. "Mrs. Southwell's put her lemon curd up for the judges. If she doesn't win this year, it'll be a scandal, mark my words." Mrs. Bartlett, her gray bun severe and eyes darting, said quietly, "It's all very well for some, what with hens that lay golden eggs, practically. But you know what they say about people who always win." Her voice dropped, and Miss Marple couldn't help but smile inwardly. St. Mary Mead's favorite sport was not, in fact, croquet or cricket, but speculation. The Fates games had begun in earnest now, the ring toss for the children, the men forming teams for tug-of-war near the orchard gate, their shirt sleeves rolled and their laughter echoing over the hedges. Somewhere behind the tea tent, a dog barked and was shushed by Miss Hartnell, whose lifelong campaign for village order extended even to the canine population. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the vicar, Lionel Southwell, as he circulated among his flock. He was a mild-mannered man, with thinning hair and an amiable smile, always ready to lend an ear or a word of encouragement. Yet today there was an edge to his manner, a certain distractedness as he checked his watch, then the grandfather clock just visible through the vicarage window. He paused beside Miss Marple, bowing slightly in greeting. "Enjoying yourself, Miss Marple?" "Very much, thank you, Reverend. I do love to watch the village come together." Her voice was gentle, but there was a note of inquiry beneath the pleasantry. It must be quite a trial to manage such a crowd. He smiled, though the gesture didn't quite reach his eyes. "Oh, Mrs. Southwell does most of the work, I assure you. I'm simply here to look pastoral." Miss Marple nodded, not missing the way he glanced again toward the house. She saw, too, the brief flicker of concern that passed across Alice Bertram's face as she hovered near the tea tent, her fair hair escaping its plait, eyes searching the crowd. Alice, just 17, was the daughter of the late schoolmaster, now an unpaid helper to Mrs. Southwell and a favorite among the Sunday school children. She seemed restless, as if waiting for something or someone. Elsewhere, Mr. Prowse, the solicitor, cut a lonely figure. He stood at the edge of the fete, a folded letter clutched in one hand, tapping it against his thigh in a steady rhythm. His normally jovial face was drawn and preoccupied, his greetings perfunctory. Every so often he would glance toward the vicarage as well, his expression unreadable. The day's peace was interrupted by the mellow chime of the vicarage clock, sounding 3 in the afternoon. The sound seemed to ripple through the party, barely noticed by most but not, Miss Marple observed, by the vicar. His smile faded. He excused himself, softly, almost apologetically, from a knot of parishioners, and slipped away toward the side entrance of the house. No one called after him. It was not unusual for the vicar to handle some pressing matter during the fete, last-minute arrangements, perhaps, or a telephone call. But after several minutes had passed, Miss Marple noted the way people began to glance about, uncertain. The fete continued, but with a sense of the air gone out of a balloon. Mrs. Southwell, formidable in her navy skirt and white gloves, redoubled her efforts to manage the event. She swept from tent to tent, issuing instructions and reassurances with the energy of a general. But as the minutes ticked on, her eyes grew pinched with worry. Miss Marple sipped her tea, observing. She noted the way Alice Bertram, now at the lemonade stand, wrung her hands in her apron. She noticed young Peter Stanning, home from his first term at Oxford, slipping quietly through the crowd, clearly searching for someone. And she noticed Mrs. Bartlett's quick, sidelong glances at the vicarage windows. A sudden shriek from the children. Someone had spilled a tray of buns, sent a flurry of adults scurrying, but even as the mess was cleaned, the festive mood never quite returned. A quarter of an hour passed. Then 20 minutes. By 3:30, a restlessness had settled on the fete like a fog. Mrs. Southwell, unable to hide her anxiety, at last made her way across the lawn to the house, heels clicking on the flagstones. Those nearby saw her re-emerge several minutes later, face pale, lips pressed into a thin line. "Has anyone seen Lionel?" she called, her voice oddly high, the faint tremor audible only to those who knew her best. "He's not in his study," and the side door was left open. A hush spread, like a dropped veil. Conversations faltered, laughter died. The villagers gathered instinctively, a herd facing the unknown. "I saw him go inside just after 3, ventured Mrs. Vickers. "Said he had a call to make, I think." "But there was no one on the line when I checked," Mrs. Southwell replied, her composure wavering. "His coat is still in the hall and, oh, I don't know what to think." The police were not called immediately. After all, people did not simply disappear from St. Mary Mead. It was unthinkable. But the sense of unease grew, fed by whispers and fearful glances. Miss Marple, silent and unassuming, rose and began a slow, deliberate circuit of the lawn, the sycamore's dappled shade her silent companion. She asked gentle questions. Had anyone seen the vicar return? Did anyone notice a stranger near the gate? Her inquiries were mild, almost absent-minded, but her eyes missed nothing. At the corner of the house, she bent to examine the gravel, noting the scuffed mark of a shoe, half obscured by the trampled grass. She paused beside the open side door, glancing at the mud smeared across the threshold. The fete, that celebration of normalcy and routine, was over. In its place, a quiet tension gripped the village. Someone, something, had disrupted the hour, and with it, the certainty that nothing ever changed in St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple, adjusting her hat against the lowering sun, felt the familiar tingle of intuition. The hour was not lost. It was simply hidden, waiting for the right eyes to find it. And hers, she suspected, would be the first to see. The village reacts. For a moment, the garden fete was frozen, the air charged with disbelief and a hint of embarrassment, as though the vicar's disappearance were some unseemly accident rather than the beginning of a mystery. Villagers who moments before had laughed over trifle and croquet now huddled in small knots, voices pitched low, eyes darting to the house and then away, as if afraid to be caught staring. Miss Marple stood quietly near the open side door, the faintest crease between her brows as she took in the marks left in the damp earth, shoes, perhaps, or merely the eager trampling of fete-goers. She straightened as Mrs. Southwell emerged once again, visibly trying to compose herself, though her voice wobbled as she attempted to rally the crowd. "Please, everyone, there's no need to worry," she announced, her hands clenching and unclenching on her clipboard. "Lionel is probably just run off to the post office or, something of the sort. I'm sure he'll be back directly." The villagers, loyal but unconvinced, murmured their assent. A few, Mr. Calthorpe the grocer, Mrs. Maynard with her sharp little nose, offered to search the nearby lanes. Peter Stanning, young and eager, dashed off toward the cricket pitch at the edge of the village, hoping perhaps to be the first with news. But already, the wind had shifted. Gossip, that old, tireless engine of St. Mary Mead, rumbled to life beneath the polite surface. Miss Hartnell, officious as always, gathered a group of ladies near the cake stall, her voice pitched in hissing whispers. "Well, I never! The vicar, of all people! It's simply not done," she insisted, her eyes wide behind steel-rimmed spectacles. "And on fête day, no less. I suppose it's stress, poor dear. Or perhaps," she paused dramatically, "perhaps it's something worse." Mrs. Bartlett's eyes gleamed. "Do you recall when Mrs. Denham's brother vanished? He'd lost half his savings in those dreadful investments. People do desperate things." Miss Marple drifted past, feigning distraction with a cluster of half-wilted roses, but listening all the same. She could feel the current of suspicion beginning to swirl, never directed at any one person for long, but changing, capricious, drawn by scraps of rumor and old wounds. From the vicarage, the chiming of the clock, now marking the quarter hour, rang hollow and strange. Inside, the house seemed to pulse with absence. Mrs. Southwell, having left the crowd in her garden, hurried from room to room with Alice Bertram at her heels. The doors stood ajar, as if expecting the vicar to reappear at any moment. Alice's voice, soft and uncertain, echoed faintly down the hall. "Should I check the cellar, ma'am?" "If you would, Alice, thank you." Mrs. Southwell's face was drawn, her composure cracking at the edges. "And perhaps the pantry. He may have needed to fetch, oh, I don't know, sugar, perhaps. Or biscuits." But both women knew this was nonsense. Lionel Southwell had never fetched biscuits in his life. Outside, the fate was dissolving. Bunting sagged in the breeze. The smell of crushed grass and spilled lemonade was suddenly cloying. Parents called children to their sides, voices sharpened by anxiety. Mr. Prowse, the solicitor, paced the perimeter of the lawn, eyes narrowed, still clutching the mysterious letter that had arrived by the noon post. He caught sight of Miss Marple and, with a visible effort, offered a strained smile. "Strange business, this. Southwell never was the sort to run off. Most reliable chap I know." Miss Marple regarded him gently. "Sometimes, Mr. Prowse, even the most reliable people are faced with unusual circumstances." He hesitated, then lowered his voice. "Do you suppose, Miss Marple, that something untoward has happened? I hate to even think it. But the side door, open like that, one hears such things these days." She offered a vague, comforting hum. "I shouldn't like to speculate just yet, Mr. Prowse. But I do believe everything happens for a reason, even disappearances. I wonder, did the vicar receive any peculiar correspondence today?" He looked startled, then pressed his lips together. "Well, as it happens, there was a letter. Not addressed to him, addressed to me, actually. Arrived in the Morning Post. But it was odd all the same." He hesitated. "Perhaps I'm making too much of it." Miss Marple let the silence stretch, the way one lets a nervous cat come close on its own terms. Eventually, he nodded and moved away, still turning the letter over in his hands. The Fates organizers did their best to maintain order. The raffle was hastily drawn, with Miss Hartnell announcing the winners in a voice that trembled only slightly. Mr. Calthorpe's daughter wept quietly when her father insisted they pack up early. She had been waiting all year to try her luck at the coconut shy. As the afternoon wore on, the sky began to dull. Clouds drifted in, blunting the sunlight, and a single, fat raindrop struck the tablecloth at the jam stall, leaving a dark circle. Most of the villagers took this as a sign and began to drift away, some in pairs, others in uneasy solitude, casting lingering glances at the silent vicarage. Within the house, Mrs. Southwell and Alice made a second search, more frantic this time. Cupboards were opened, curtains thrown back, and the vicar's study was ransacked for clues, a process observed quietly by Miss Marple, who arrived with a gentle knock and a few murmured words of comfort. The study was a cool, book-lined room with a desk littered with correspondence and the unmistakable scent of pipe tobacco lingering in the air. On the desk, a half-written sermon, an open Bible, and a teacup with a faint rim of lipstick, surely Mrs. Southwell's, left earlier. Nothing seemed out of place, yet the room felt heavy, expectant. "I can't imagine where he's gone," Mrs. Southwell admitted, her voice breaking for the first time. Lionel is not a man given to flights of fancy. Alice perched on the arm of a faded armchair, wringing her hands. He seemed preoccupied all morning. I thought it was just the fate. He always worries about the weather and the raffle tickets. But today he was different. Miss Marple touched her gloved hand to Alice's. Did he mention anything unusual? Any visitors? Telephone calls, perhaps? Alice shook her head. No one special. Only Mr. Prowse stopped by. Oh, and the delivery boy from Ashton's. He brought the eggs as usual. And a parcel, but I never saw who it was for. Mrs. Southwell brightened at the mention of the parcel. It was for the church, new candlesticks, I think. I unpacked them myself. Nothing strange there. The grandfather clock chimed the hour, 4 o'clock. The fete was officially over. Beyond the windows, the last of the villagers were retreating down the lane, heads together, voices urgent and low. As Miss Marple stepped into the hallway, she paused at the side door. The mud on the threshold had begun to dry, and beneath the scuffs, she saw what might have been the imprint of a boot, larger than the vicar's, certainly. She stooped, examining a faint thread caught on the latch. Blue wool, perhaps from a coat sleeve, almost invisible unless one was looking for it. A movement in the garden caught her eye. Young Peter standing was returning, cheeks flushed, hair windblown. He shook his head at Mrs. Hartnell, who had stationed herself by the gate as if she alone could prevent further disappearances. No sign of him. No one seen him along the lanes, not at the station either. I checked. A few stragglers lingered, Mrs. Bartlett and Mrs. Vickers, deep in anxious conversation, Mr. Calthorpe, silent and frowning, Alice, hovering on the steps as if unable to leave. The mood was subdued, fractured, as if the fate had been a fever dream from which everyone was waking. Miss Marple watched as the village slowly emptied, its certainties left in tatters. The vicarage, that heart of St. Mary Mead, stood mute and enigmatic against the fading sky. Night would fall soon, and with it, 100 new rumors would blossom. But as the villagers slipped home, latching doors and drawing curtains, Miss Marple remained. She wandered the perimeter of the house once more, her mind turning over every word, every glance, every hint of discord among the tidy hedges. Whatever had become of Lionel Southwell, his absence was now woven into the fabric of the village, no longer merely a puzzle, but a wound. And Miss Marple, beneath her calm exterior, felt the sting of it, sharper and stranger than anything St. Mary Mead had known for years. Chapter 2. Early Investigation. The fading afternoon slipped quietly into early evening, leaving behind a village unsettled. By supper time, word of the Vicarage Vanishing had seeped into every kitchen and parlor in St. Mary Mead, passing from lips to ears with the stealth and persistence of smoke. Lamps were lit, shades drawn, and neighbors gathered in cozy conspiracies, debating, comforting, and, inevitably, speculating. Miss Marple, meanwhile, had returned to her neat cottage on the lane, but not to rest. She changed from her fete attire to a plain house frock, set her kettle on to boil, and arranged herself by the sitting-room window where she could see the comings and goings along the road. From there, she observed the trickle of villagers moving past the vicarage, heads bent, some casting furtive glances at its silent facade, as though expecting the Reverend Southwell to step out and declare it all a misunderstanding. She could not shake the conviction that, in the hour that was missing, something profound had shifted beneath the surface calm of St. Mary Mead. And so she sat quietly, knitting in her lap, letting the rhythmic click of her needles soothe the unease that gnawed at the corners of her mind. At 6:30, the first sign of official concern arrived, a police motor car rumbling down the lane. Sergeant Hayward stepped out, familiar in his dark uniform and gravelly manner, accompanied by Constable Forbes. The two officers exchanged greetings with Miss Marple as they passed her gate. Sergeant Hayward tipped his hat. "Evenin', Miss Marple. Strange doings?" She smiled gently. "Very strange, Sergeant. I do hope you find the vicar safe and sound." He nodded, grave. "We'll do our best, miss. Not the sort of thing one expects in St. Mary Mead." As the officers continued to the vicarage, Miss Marple tucked away her knitting and rose to fetch her shawl. She had no intention of interfering, But she knew well enough that certain doors opened more easily to a harmless old lady than to a uniformed policeman. Inside the vicarage, the search had begun in earnest. Sergeant Hayward spoke quietly with Mrs. Southwell in the drawing room, while Constable Forbes moved from room to room, careful not to disturb the household more than necessary. The house itself was tidy, almost suspiciously so, Miss Marple thought, as she was invited inside by a grateful and exhausted Mrs. Southwell. "It's good of you to come, Miss Marple," the vicar's wife murmured, her eyes red-rimmed but dry. "I just can't believe it. Lionel would never run off. Not with the fate, not with all his responsibilities. I know something is wrong." Miss Marple offered a comforting hand. "He's a creature of habit, isn't he? That's what makes it all the more unusual." As Hayward made his way to the study, Miss Marple quietly followed, her eyes sweeping over the details. The overturned teacup, surely the vicar's, as there was no lipstick mark, the open hymn book beside his desk, the faint trace of pipe ash on the windowsill. "Nothing amiss, really," Hayward muttered, more to himself than to her. No sign of a struggle. Just gone. In the corner, Alice Bertram lingered, hugging her arms about herself. Her gaze drifted toward the garden through the study window, as if expecting someone to appear. "Did you notice anything odd this afternoon, Alice?" Miss Marple asked gently, moving closer. Alice hesitated. "He seemed worried. More than usual. He asked me to fetch the post twice, once just before the fete and again after. But there was nothing special, only that parcel for Mrs. Southwell and Mr. Prowse's letter." "And you're sure he didn't receive any other messages? Perhaps a telephone call?" Alice shook her head. "Not that I heard." As Miss Marple pondered this, Sergeant Hayward entered with a quiet cough. "Excuse me, ma'am, Mrs. Southwell, do you know if your husband took anything with him? Any bags, perhaps, or his wallet?" She shook her head. "No, nothing. His wallet and watch are in the study, just as he left them. And his coat, still in the hall." The constable appeared with the vicar's hat, which he'd found hanging on its usual peg by the door. "Doesn't look like he meant to go far," he offered. "Bit odd that." Miss Marple stood, unobtrusive but attentive, as the officers made notes and asked further questions. She let her eyes wander about the study, the neat arrangement of sermon notes, the penciled schedule for the fete pinned to the corkboard, a stack of charity receipts, and a list of volunteers, some names crossed out, others underlined. As the police moved on, she noticed something small, the tiniest smear of mud on the edge of the desk drawer, quickly wiped but not entirely gone. Most curious, she thought. Outside, twilight gathered in the garden. Mrs. Hartnell approached, her shoes crunching on the gravel. She carried an armful of forgotten tablecloths and an expression equal parts righteous indignation and fear. "I've told everyone to keep an eye out for anything out of the ordinary," she informed Sergeant Hayward, voice brisk. "No one saw the vicar leave, not a soul. And you can be certain I would have noticed. I have a clear view from my stall." Sergeant Hayward thanked her politely, but Miss Marple sensed the irritation beneath his patience. Small towns bred their own brand of self-appointed detectives, she mused, but sometimes, amid the noise, a true detail could be revealed. As the evening deepened, the search spread outward. The lane leading away from the vicarage was examined, hedgerows prodded, and the footpath to the churchyard checked. Mr. Calthorpe's boy was dispatched to the post office, just in case. The porter at the railway station confirmed no one fitting the vicar's description had been seen that afternoon. The Southwell household, meanwhile, was subdued. Mrs. Southwell, her hands trembling only when she thought herself unobserved, prepared a tray of sandwiches and tea for the officers. Alice Bertram remained nearby, pale and silent. Mr. Prowse arrived just after 7, clutching his letter, but offered little new information. "It's a mystery, that's certain," he said to Miss Marple in the hallway. "No word, no trace. It's as if he simply evaporated." Miss Marple glanced at the letter. "You received that this morning, didn't you?" He hesitated, then nodded. "Yes. Not from anyone I know. No signature. Just a request to meet, though it doesn't say where or when." He showed her the note, short, typed, and unsigned. She studied it briefly, but said nothing. The wheels in her mind were turning. As the hour grew late, villagers brought lanterns and torches to aid the search. The church bell tolled once, solemn and lonely, as a few of the men made their way across the green, eyes fixed to the ground for signs. A dropped handkerchief, a torn scrap of paper, anything. Yet nothing more was found. No evidence. No message. Only the echo of footsteps, the hush of anxious voices, and the persistent, uncanny sense of a piece missing from the clockwork of the village. As midnight approached, Sergeant Hayward gathered his men and prepared to leave. "We'll return in the morning," he assured Mrs. Southwell, who nodded numbly. "If you recall anything at all, let us know." Miss Marple remained at the vicarage gate for a long moment, watching the last lights flicker out along the lane. She heard a nightingale's solitary song, the far-off clatter of a gate. In her mind, the threads of the mystery tangled and untangled, patterns emerging and fading. A vanished vicar. An unsigned letter. A fate unraveling into suspicion. As she finally turned for home, Miss Marple's eyes, calm and thoughtful, betrayed nothing of the sharp intellect behind them. Tomorrow would bring new questions, new stories. Tonight, St. Mary Mead lay uneasy in its bed, unaware, perhaps, that its quietest observer was already seeing more than most would ever guess, first suspects. Morning arrived in St. Mary Mead beneath a low ceiling of pewter clouds, the sort that threatened rain but rarely delivered it, adding to the village's sense of anxious suspension. No vicar had appeared on the green. No word had come in the night. By 7, the church bells had rung their usual call to prayer, but the sound felt strange, even mournful, without Reverend Southwell's steady hand. As the village roused, the search resumed. Constable Forbes, looking pale from lack of sleep, organized a new sweep of the vicarage grounds. Sergeant Hayward arrived shortly after 8, greeted by Mrs. Southwell in the hallway, whose face had aged overnight, eyes ringed with exhaustion. "It's not like him, Sergeant. I cannot emphasize that enough," she insisted, voice thin but determined. "He would never abandon his post, not even for an hour, certainly not for a whole night. Something has happened. I know it." Hayward, respectful but methodical, nodded. "We'll find him, ma'am. We have men checking the lanes and fields, and Constable Forbes will search the vicarage garden again. I'll need a list of anyone who visited yesterday, before, during, or after the fete." Mrs. Southwell obliged, producing a neat page in her familiar looping script. Hayward ran his finger down the list, murmuring names: Mrs. Hartnell, Mr. Prowse, Miss Bertram, the Ashtons' delivery boy, and, curiously, Peter Stanning, who had dropped by the study early to return a borrowed book. The vicarage itself, with its tidy rooms and polished floors, now seemed oddly sinister in its silence. The dining table was set for breakfast, 2 places, marmalade jar unopened, tea left to grow cold. A walking stick leaned in the umbrella stand, just as Lionel Southwell had left it the day before. The only thing truly amiss was the man himself. Outside, a crowd had formed along the lane. Villagers huddled in clusters, wrapped in shawls and worried speculation, waiting for news. The fate's decorations, forgotten and sodden, fluttered in the damp air, like relics of a vanished happiness. Miss Marple, arriving just after 9, was greeted with a chorus of anxious voices. "Have they found anything?" Mrs. Vickers whispered. "Did you hear about the boot print by the side door?" added Mrs. Bartlett, who always knew things first, or at least claimed she did. "And Alice Bertram, she was the last to see him, I heard," murmured Miss Hartnell, her tone equal parts accusation and concern. Miss Marple, her expression serene, offered no opinions. Instead, she excused herself and crossed the lawn, careful to avoid the area where Forbes and young Peter standing now combed the flower beds. She paused to watch them, Forbes, scraping mud from the garden path. Peter, pale and tight-lipped, eyes darting as though searching for approval or absolution. "Anything yet, Constable?" Miss Marple called, her voice mild. "Nothing, I'm afraid, Miss Marple. Just footprints, lots of them. Could be anyone's from the fete." Forbes shrugged. Peter added quietly, I was just looking for my book. I left it in the study. But it wasn't there." Miss Marple inclined her head. "What sort of book, Peter?" He flushed. Greek poetry. Reverend Southwell was helping me with translation. I left it after our lesson yesterday, just before the fete began. Forbes looked at him curiously. Did you see the vicar after that? No. He said he had things to prepare. I left through the back gate. Peter's voice was brittle, too quick, and Miss Marple made a mental note. Inside the vicarage, Mrs. Southwell sat in the drawing room, Alice Bertram by her side. Both women were drawn and silent, their previous composure now mere camouflage for their distress. Miss Marple joined them, hands folded over her reticule. Alice, staring into her lap, finally spoke. I wish I knew what happened, Miss Marple. He seemed upset but not frightened. He asked me twice about the post, nothing out of the ordinary. Except, she hesitated. Yes, dear? Well, there was a man at the gate in the morning. Not from the village, I'm sure of it. He asked for the vicar, but I said he was busy preparing for the fete. He left before I could fetch Reverend Southwell. I didn't think anything of it. Mrs. Southwell looked up sharply. You never mentioned this, Alice. I forgot with everything happening. I'm sorry, ma'am. Miss Marple considered this silently, tucking it away among her growing collection of observations. A stranger, a nervous Peter, a missing book. All fragments, but perhaps a pattern would emerge. Sergeant Hayward joined them, notepad in hand. Mrs. Southwell, Alice, do you recall the color of this man's coat? Anything unusual about his manner? Alice shook her head. I think it was dark blue, navy maybe. He seemed polite enough, just anxious to see the vicar. Hayward scribbled a note, brow furrowed. If he comes back, you let us know immediately. As the morning waned, suspicion began to settle in familiar grooves. The first to attract real scrutiny was Alice Bertram, by simple proximity. She lived at the vicarage, helped daily with parish work, and had, by her own admission, been one of the last to see him. I don't like to say it, Mrs. Bartlett whispered to Mrs. Vickers as they left the gate, but it's always the ones you least expect. Quiet, helpful girls? You never know what goes on beneath the surface. The second was Peter Stanning, whose nervousness and missing book had not gone unnoticed. His mother, Mrs. Stanning, appeared mid-morning to collect him, her manner defensive. Peter wouldn't hurt a fly. He's devoted to the Reverend. He's helped him every Sunday since he was a boy. But her hands trembled as she spoke, and more than one villager noticed. A third shadow of doubt drifted over Mr. Prowse. His unusual letter, shown at last to the police, raised questions. Its brief, urgent language, meet me at the hour. Come alone. Do not tell your wife, struck a sinister note, even as Prowse insisted he had not shared its contents with anyone but Miss Marple. By midday, as a weak sun struggled through the clouds, Sergeant Hayward called a brief meeting in the vicarage drawing room. Police and villagers alike gathered, chairs creaking, tea cooling on the tray. We must consider the possibility that Reverend Southwell left the house willingly, Hayward began. But we can't discount foul play. If anyone remembers anything, any quarrels, odd visitors, missing objects, speak up. The silence that followed was thick with fear and guilt, each person secretly reviewing their own words and actions. Miss Marple listened, watching faces, Alice's pale resolve, Peter's anxious guilt, Mrs. Southwell's exhaustion, Prowse's guarded silence. Even Mrs. Hartnell, ever eager for drama, now looked genuinely unsettled. As the villagers trickled away, Miss Marple lingered. She wandered the garden one more time, eyes keen beneath her modest hat. She stooped to examine the faded blue thread on the side door latch, now almost vanished in the damp air. She traced the path through the flower beds where footprints mingled and disappeared. The investigation was underway, its suspects named, yet the truth, Miss Marple sensed, remained as elusive as ever. She paused beneath the sycamore, glancing back at the vicarage windows. Somewhere among these ordinary people, a secret waited to be found. And if she had learned anything in her many years of watching human nature, it was that secrets, like seeds, could never stay buried for long. Chapter 3. A Hidden Clue. The afternoon brought an uneasy quiet to St. Mary Mead, the kind that made every dog's bark and every cartwheel on the lane sound unnaturally loud. The village's routines continued, bread delivered, windows washed, the grocer sweeping his step, but all with a careful, watchful air. At the vicarage, the search had shifted from frantic to methodical, as if the very act of repeating old questions and retracing steps might restore a sense of normalcy. Miss Marple, however, was not one for wasted motion. After a brief visit with Mrs. Southwell, offering a plate of homemade seed cake and a listening ear, she excused herself from the increasingly crowded sitting room. With Constable Forbes's distracted blessing, she slipped out into the vicarage's side garden, her eyes lingering on the familiar landmarks: the kitchen window, the battered watering can beneath the lilac, and the well-trodden path leading toward the churchyard gate. It was here, beneath the faded bunting that still clung stubbornly to the privet hedge, that Miss Marple knelt to examine the earth. The morning dew had mostly dried, but traces of mud remained, a confusion of footprints, pressed deep by the fate's revelers and now overlain by the boots of constables and worried villagers. Yet to Miss Marple's practiced eye, one print stood out, a sharper, larger impression, the heel worn at an odd angle. She traced its outline with a gloved finger, noting the peculiar pattern on the sole, a half-moon notch. She stood, brushing dirt from her skirt, and cast her gaze along the path. The print led from the open side door toward the hedge, then disappeared entirely where the grass began, a trick she knew well from her years of gardening and quiet observation. The person who'd left it had been careful, but not careful enough. A small, pale object caught her eye near the base of the hedge. She stooped again and pinched it delicately between thumb and forefinger, a button, navy blue, still gleaming with a hint of polish. It seemed almost too neat, as if deliberately left behind. But Miss Marple trusted no such accidents. She straightened, tucking the button into her handkerchief, and turned her thoughts back to the conversation with Alice Bertram. A stranger in a navy coat. A missing vicar. And now a button, perhaps from that very coat, or another entirely. It was not evidence, yet, but it was something, a kernel of truth in a garden of confusion. Back inside the vicarage, the mood had darkened. Mrs. Southwell, exhausted from worry and from retelling the same story to Sergeant Hayward, sat with her head bowed over a teacup she did not drink. Alice lingered near the stairs, as if half hoping for the vicar's sudden, miraculous return. Peter, standing, summoned again for questioning, stood awkwardly by the fireplace, his arms folded tight. Sergeant Hayward, not a man known for delicacy, cleared his throat. "Now, Peter, let's go over it one more time. You came to the study yesterday morning?" Peter's cheeks flamed. "Yes, sir. About 9. I left my book? Well, it was more the vicar's than mine. I borrowed it last week." "And did you see anyone else in the house?" "No, just Alice in the kitchen. And I heard Mr. Prowse talking with the vicar in the hall." Hayward jotted notes, lips pursed. "And you left through the back? Didn't see anyone in the lane?" "No, sir. I went home. My mother can confirm it." Miss Marple, hovering discreetly in the corner, watched Peter's hands. They trembled just slightly as he spoke. She also noted the quick glance exchanged between him and Alice, a silent conversation she could not decipher, but whose very existence suggested more than either would admit. After Peter was excused, Mr. Prowse entered, summoned by Hayward's request. The solicitor's face was drawn, his usual confidence gone. "Mr. Prowse, about that letter," Hayward began. "Are you certain it was meant for you? No chance it was intended for the vicar?" Prowse bristled. "Of course it was meant for me, the address is clear. But the contents were odd, I grant you. It asked for a meeting at the hour, but gave no place. I thought perhaps it was a joke or a mistake." Miss Marple's gentle voice interjected. "But you showed it to Reverend Southwell, didn't you?" A flicker of surprise crossed Prowse's features. "Yes, I did. He seemed quite interested, in fact. Asked me twice about it." "Did you leave the letter in his study?" Prowse hesitated. "No, I took it with me. I still have it." He produced the folded sheet, its edges now smudged with frequent handling. Miss Marple read it again, her eyes lingering on the peculiar phrasing, "Meet me at the hour. Do not delay." It had the air of desperation, or perhaps warning. The afternoon dragged on, the search radiating outward from the vicarage. The churchyard was scoured, the path to the post office checked, and a pair of constables were dispatched to the railway station to inquire about strangers. But everywhere the answer was the same: no one had seen the vicar, nor any man in a navy coat, since the fete. Back in the village, suspicion now hung heavy, falling in silent accusations and speculative glances. Mrs. Bartlett had taken up residence at her front window, ready to pounce on any detail, however slight. In the grocer's, Mrs. Vickers repeated the tale of the blue-coated stranger so often it had already become legend. Miss Hartnell, meanwhile, had set about organizing a volunteer watch, ostensibly to help the police, though it was clear she relished the air of purpose and authority. Amidst the noise, Miss Marple's quiet work continued. She visited the Stanning house, ostensibly to deliver a pot of quince jelly, but in truth to observe Peter in his home environment. Mrs. Stanning, anxious and defensive, ushered her in with forced cheer. "Peter's been terribly upset," she confided as they settled in the parlor. "He thinks everyone is watching him. And his poor book, Greek, was it, has gone missing entirely." Miss Marple nodded sympathetically. "It must be a comfort having him at home with you." Mrs. Stanning's smile faltered. "He was here all afternoon after the fete, I can assure you. He barely left my sight." Peter entered, shoulders hunched. He nodded at Miss Marple, then settled by the window. She watched as he fiddled with his cuff, an old habit of anxious boys everywhere, and noticed the threadbare edges, as if a button had come loose not long ago. "Do you remember seeing anyone unusual in the lane, Peter?" Miss Marple asked gently. He shook his head. "No, only the delivery boy from Ashton's and Mrs. Hartnell. I tried to read, but I couldn't focus." Miss Marple let the silence hang, waiting to see if he would add anything more. When he didn't, she simply thanked them for their hospitality and excused herself. As she walked back toward her cottage, Miss Marple weighed what she had gathered. The navy button in her handkerchief, the anxious glances, the lost book, the mysterious letter. Each clue was a thread, not yet woven together. She passed the churchyard, pausing by the lich gate. There, among the daisies and tall grass, she spotted another small object glinting in the weak sunlight, a scrap of blue wool, snagged on a thorn. Carefully she tucked it away. The mystery of the vicar's disappearance had not been solved, but Miss Marple, with her deep knowledge of human nature and her quiet certainty, felt she was just a little closer to the truth. Night fell once again over St. Mary Mead, and as the lamps glimmered in cottage windows, the secrets of the village seemed to grow thicker in the dusk, waiting, as always, for someone with patient eyes to see them for what they were: confrontations and secrets. The dusk of the second day saw St. Mary Mead teetering on the edge of panic and exhaustion. The vanished vicar had now become a shadow over every conversation, a silent figure glimpsed in the corners of anxious minds. With each passing hour, the certainties that underpinned village life, order, decency, the expectation that tomorrow would look very much like today, felt more fragile. The police search was thorough but had slowed, their methods grinding against the quiet stubbornness of local custom. Sergeant Hayward's rounds were now less about new clues and more about revisiting old stories, hoping the act of repetition might shake something loose. But St. Mary Mead was a village of secrets, and secrets, Miss Marple often mused, were both more common and more perilous than anyone cared to admit. She found herself called upon that evening to comfort Mrs. Southwell, who had reached the weary end of her stoic reserve. The vicar's wife sat in the parlor, her knitting abandoned in a heap, her eyes rimmed red with sleeplessness. "I keep thinking I'll hear his step on the gravel," she confessed, voice trembling. "And then I remember, and it's as if the house itself mourns." Miss Marple patted her hand gently. "It's in the nature of houses to keep their memories, I think. Yours will feel right again in time." She let the silence linger, giving Mrs. Southwell space to recover herself. Their talk was interrupted by the arrival of Mr. Prowse, the solicitor, who had grown increasingly agitated as the investigation dragged on. He hovered in the doorway, twisting his hat between his hands. "Forgive me, Mrs. Southwell, Miss Marple. I wondered if either of you had heard from the bishop. I sent a telegram, as you suggested. There's been no reply." Mrs. Southwell shook her head. I fear the bishop is not a man to be hurried, Mr. Prowse. But thank you for trying. Miss Marple studied the solicitor's anxious face, the way his eyes flickered about the room as if seeking a mislaid object. You seem troubled, Mr. Prowse. More so than usual. He hesitated, then let out a sharp breath. It's this business of the letter, Miss Marple. The police have asked me about it half a dozen times, and I swear to you, I don't know what it means. I've had nothing but anonymous queries about parish finances for months, but never anything so cryptic. Before Miss Marple could reply, Alice Bertram appeared in the hall, clutching a basket of pressed linens. Her pallor had deepened, and she moved with the stiff caution of someone being observed. Oh, Miss Marple, I didn't see you come in. Her voice was small. That's quite all right, dear. I was just leaving. But perhaps you could walk me to the gate? The air will do us both good. Outside, the evening was cool and gentle. The hush between them was companionable, but Miss Marple, with the deftness of long practice, steered the conversation toward Alice's mood. You're carrying a heavy burden, I think, she said softly. Alice stared at the roses nodding along the path. I suppose I am. People are looking at me as if I've done something wrong. That must be unpleasant, Miss Marple agreed. But you've nothing to reproach yourself for, unless you haven't told the whole truth. Alice's steps faltered. I suppose there's always more to the story, isn't there? Not everyone in the vicarage was happy these last few weeks. There were arguments, nothing terrible but... Miss Marple's tone was gentle but persistent. Between whom? Alice glanced over her shoulder, voice dropping. The vicar and Mr. Prowse, mostly. They disagreed about the parish fund, how to use it, what to do about the old schoolhouse. Reverend Southwell wanted to offer shelter to evacuees, but Mr. Prowse thought it was too great a risk, said the accounts wouldn't stand up to scrutiny. Miss Marple nodded, storing the information away. And did you ever overhear them discussing the letter? Alice hesitated. No, not exactly. But I did hear Mr. Prowse say something about protecting the parish from scandal. He sounded frightened. As they reached the gate, Alice paused. Miss Marple, do you think he's dead? The vicar? The old lady's eyes softened. I hope not, dear. But whatever has happened, the truth will come out. They parted, and Miss Marple made her way along the hedge, pausing as she reached the village green. Night had fully fallen now, and lanterns glowed in the windows of every house. There was a hush in the air, as though the village itself were holding its breath. She turned up the lane toward the Stanning house. Mrs. Stanning greeted her with thinly disguised impatience, but let her in. Peter was sitting by the fire, knees drawn up, his schoolbooks scattered about him. Good evening, Peter, Miss Marple said. You look tired. He glanced up, startled. I suppose I am. I haven't been able to sleep. Miss Marple settled across from him, observing the tension in his posture. That's not unusual, given the circumstances. But you mustn't let other people's suspicions trouble you. If you're innocent, the truth will show itself. He bit his lip. It's not that, Miss Marple. It's just, I feel like everyone expects me to know something. Or to confess. I don't know what to say. Sometimes, when we're frightened, we hide the truth, even from ourselves, Miss Marple replied. Were you and Reverend Southwell on good terms lately? He nodded, then shook his head. He was helping me with my studies. But I let him down. I lost that book, he trusted me and I lost it. His voice broke. I thought if I found it I could make things right. Miss Marple leaned forward. You're sure you lost it at the vicarage? He hesitated. I think so. But after all the confusion at the fete, I'm not certain. I might have dropped it on the lane. Or maybe someone picked it up. Miss Marple placed a gentle hand on his. Try not to worry about the book, Peter. There are more important things at stake now. She rose, bidding them good night, and stepped into the cool air once more. The green was empty now, save for a single figure standing by the war memorial, Mrs. Bartlett, bundled in her shawl, scanning the shadows as if hoping to glimpse something hidden. Miss Marple joined her quietly. A terrible business, isn't it, Miss Marple? Mrs. Bartlett whispered. I can't help but think, There are things about this village we'd rather not know. Miss Marple agreed. Sometimes, it's the things we least wish to know that matter most. Mrs. Bartlett lowered her voice. You keep your eyes open. Some people have more to hide than they let on. I've seen Mr. Prowse out late, wandering near the church. And that Alice, she's always listening at doors. Mark my words, this won't end tidy. As she shuffled off, Miss Marple stood for a moment, absorbing the heaviness that had settled over the village. She thought of secrets, large and small, each one a stone in the wall that kept the truth just out of sight. She turned homeward, mind alive with possibilities, the anxious solicitor, the burdened housemaid, the troubled student. Somewhere, among the ordinary gestures and practiced alibis, lay the answer. And as she slipped into her own cottage, Miss Marple resolved to let nothing pass unremarked, not a frayed cuff, nor a careless word, nor a button glinting beneath a hedge. For in a village like St. Mary Mead, it was always the little things that brought a mystery to light. Chapter 4. Another twist. By the following morning, the mood in St. Mary Mead was taut as a wire. An early mist clung to hedges and gravestones, swallowing the sunlight, and giving the village an unfamiliar hush. Rumors, once a gentle background hum, now surged and twisted through every cottage. Some villagers claimed to have seen shadowy figures on the green, others whispered of strange lights by the lich gate after midnight. The vicar's disappearance had become a kind of fever, one that burned with the heat of secrets, half-truths, and superstitions. Miss Marple began her day as always, tending to her small back garden. Yet her mind was not on the marigolds or the blackbirds quarreling in the branches. She considered, with patient clarity, the fragments she'd gathered: a navy button, a scrap of blue wool, the faint tread of a boot, the uneasy web of tension among the villagers. Each clue teased at her memory, forming half a picture she could not yet bring into focus. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. It was Constable Forbes, his cap in hand, his expression unusually grave. "Sorry to trouble you, Miss Marple. Sergeant Hayward asks if you might come to the vicarage straight away." "Of course, Constable. Is there news?" "There's something, miss. Better let the sergeant tell you himself." The urgency in his voice left little room for doubt. Within minutes, Miss Marple had gathered her things and made her way up the lane. The village seemed to hold its breath as she passed, faces peering from behind curtains, conversations halting at her approach. Everyone, it seemed, sensed a change in the air. At the vicarage, a small crowd had gathered, Mrs. Southwell in her faded dressing gown, Alice Bertram pale and anxious, Mrs. Hartnell clutching her handbag as if it were a lifeline, and Peter standing awkwardly to the side, eyes fixed on his shoes. Sergeant Hayward stood by the open study door, his face set in lines of concern. He gestured for Miss Marple to follow him inside. "We found something. Or rather, someone did. Out by the boundary of the vicarage grounds, behind the old yew hedge." Miss Marple's gaze sharpened, though her voice remained calm. "Not the vicar?" Hayward shook his head. "No, miss. But, well, see for yourself." He led her through the back door and down a path choked with nettles, where Constable Forbes waited, notebook in hand. At their feet lay a battered old satchel, half hidden by brambles and dusted with morning dew. Its leather was cracked and faded, the initials Ellis barely legible beneath the grime. "It's the vicar's," said Mrs. Southwell, who had hurried after them. "He took it on parish visits, always said it was good for carrying ledgers and small gifts." Hayward carefully opened the satchel. Inside were several notebooks, a broken fountain pen, a string of prayer beads, and, a gasp went through the assembled villagers, a torn and blood-stained handkerchief, monogrammed with the vicar's initials. The discovery sent a ripple of fear through the crowd. Mrs. Southwell pressed her hand to her mouth. Alice swayed on her feet. Only Miss Marple seemed unflustered, her mind already spinning forward. "We checked the grounds, miss," Forbes explained, "and found tracks leading from the yew hedge toward the churchyard, one set of large boots and another smaller, lighter. Whoever was here, they weren't alone." Hayward nodded. "And the blood? Well, it's not fresh, but it's there all the same. No sign of the vicar himself, though." The news moved through the village like a storm. Speculation reignited. Some believed the vicar had met with violence, others muttered of abduction or blackmail. Even the most rational began to eye their neighbors with suspicion. In the chaos, Miss Marple's mind turned over the evidence. The satchel, abandoned but not hidden. The handkerchief, deliberately left or lost in a struggle. 2 sets of footprints, one matching the peculiar boot print she had found in the garden. Back inside the vicarage, Mrs. Southwell sat in rigid silence, her hands clasped tightly. Sergeant Hayward questioned her gently, probing for any detail she might have overlooked. "Did your husband have enemies, ma'am? Anyone who might wish him harm?" Mrs. Southwell shook her head. "No enemies. But lately he was anxious. Worried about the parish fund, the accounts. He felt someone was watching him." Miss Marple, listening, caught the note of fear in the vicar's wife's voice. She wondered again about Mr. Prowse, and the quarrel Alice had overheard. She remembered, too, Peter's distress over the missing book, and Alice's hesitation when describing the stranger at the gate. Later that morning, Miss Marple quietly approached Alice, who was folding laundry in the kitchen. "You're frightened, my dear. But not just because of the vicar's disappearance." Alice's hands stilled. "There's so much I don't understand, Miss Marple. I thought it was just nerves, the fate, the guests, all the fuss. But after the vicar went missing, I found something." "What was it?" Alice hesitated, then drew a folded slip of paper from her apron pocket. "This. It was under the stairs. It looks like a receipt, but it's not for anything from the parish." Miss Marple examined the paper. It was a pawn ticket, issued in London, dated just 3 days prior. The item pledged, a gold watch and chain. "Did Reverend Southwell own a gold watch?" Miss Marple asked. Alice nodded. "It was a gift from the bishop when he first took the parish. He prized it, wore it every Sunday." "And has it been missed?" Alice blinked, realization dawning. "No one's asked about it. I just assumed, oh, but if he pawned it. Or someone else did, Alice. Someone who knew its value." Miss Marple slipped the ticket into her reticule. She had learned, over a lifetime of observing the small tragedies and triumphs of village life, that theft was often less about greed than desperation. Meanwhile, Sergeant Hayward's inquiries turned again to Peter Stanning. The discovery of the satchel had cast the boy in a new, sharper light. His nervousness, once dismissed as mere youthful anxiety, now struck some as evidence of guilt. Hayward questioned him closely. "Peter, you said you left the vicarage through the back gate the morning of the fete. Did you pass the yew hedge?" Peter nodded, voice shaky. "Yes, sir. I was looking for my book. I didn't see anything out of place. I promise." "Were you alone?" The pause. "Yes. I thought I was. But I heard someone behind me, footsteps, maybe. I didn't look back." In the village, tongues wagged anew. Mrs. Bartlett all but declared Peter guilty. Mrs. Hartnell insisted Alice knew more than she let on. The grocer's wife swore she'd seen Mr. Prowse slip out late at night, his face shadowed and grim. But as Miss Marple returned to her cottage, she held tightly to her growing sense of the truth. The pawn ticket, the satchel, the handkerchief, the footprints, each was a clue, and each pointed to a drama more tangled than the village suspected. The vicar was still missing, and now it seemed someone else had something very grave to hide. The question was, who? And how much time remained before the truth would demand to be told? As the mist finally burned away, and sunlight filtered through the clouds, Miss Marple sat quietly at her window, watching and waiting. In St. Mary Mead, secrets never slept for long. The net tightens. After the discovery of the vicar's satchel and the blood-stained handkerchief, St. Mary Mead was transformed. The ordinary rhythms of village life, calls of milkmen, the sweep of brooms, the cheery wave from one neighbor to another, were disrupted by the sharp edge of suspicion. No one went about their business quite as usual. Instead, eyes watched, voices dropped, and everyone looked over their shoulder as if a shadow lurked just out of sight. Miss Marple, though always polite and unobtrusive, found herself suddenly central to the villagers' whispered debates. She noticed the way Mrs. Hartnell's lips tightened when their paths crossed at the bakery, and how Mr. Calthorpe the grocer seemed to hold back from speaking too freely when she entered his shop. She could sense it in the air. The vicar's vanishing had made everyone reconsider what they thought they knew about their neighbors and themselves. For her part, Miss Marple kept a careful eye on the vicarage and its inhabitants. That afternoon, she brought over a basket of scones, ostensibly to comfort Mrs. Southwell, but in truth to observe the goings-on for herself. The vicar's wife greeted her with gratitude that was tinged by exhaustion and dread. "Thank you, Jane. I barely slept last night," Mrs. Southwell confided, ushering her into the parlor. "The village is changing, Miss Marple. I feel it in my bones. It's as though we're all holding our breath, waiting for something dreadful." Miss Marple patted her hand. "Perhaps the most dreadful thing has already happened, my dear. Now it is only the not knowing that frightens us." Alice Bertram was in the kitchen, staring absently at a mug of tea gone cold. She looked up when Miss Marple entered, her face pale and drawn. The events of the past days had changed her. She seemed older, as if forced too quickly into a world of grief and uncertainty. "Would you join me in the garden for a few moments, Alice?" Miss Marple asked. "I think the air will do us good." Alice hesitated, but agreed, and together they stepped outside. The garden, still showing the scars of the fate, trampled flower beds, bunting fluttering forlornly, was strangely quiet. It was as if the very earth remembered what had transpired. They walked in silence to the lilac bush, where Miss Marple knelt and examined the ground. The peculiar boot print, half obliterated now by police and villagers, was still faintly visible. Alice watched her with wide, anxious eyes. "Do you think he's—" Alice could not finish. Miss Marple shook her head. "The truth often hides in plain sight, Alice. Sometimes all it takes is patience and a willingness to see what others do not." Alice wrapped her arms around herself. "I keep thinking, if I'd just stayed near the study that day, or if I'd told Mrs. Southwell about the stranger right away. But I was frightened. He seemed so out of place here. Not cruel as tut. And the way he looked at the vicar." Miss Marple regarded her kindly. "Do you remember anything else about him? Even a small detail?" Alice frowned, searching her memory. "His voice. It was very low, almost like he was trying not to be overheard. And his hands, they were ink-stained. I remember thinking he must write for a living. Or perhaps he was a clerk." Miss Marple nodded. Every detail was a seed, waiting for the right time to sprout. They returned inside, where Sergeant Hayward had just arrived, his hat in hand. The satchel and its grim contents had put new urgency into his steps. "I'll need a word, Miss Marple, if you've a moment," he said, nodding toward the quiet of the library. She joined him, and he closed the door softly behind them. "You've been helpful to us, Miss Marple. I wonder if you'd be willing to look over this list of names." He produced a page filled with neat writing. "Everyone who was on the vicarage grounds during the fete. We're trying to narrow the window, who was near the house just before Reverend Southwell vanished." Miss Marple took the list, her eyes running down it. Mrs. Southwell, Alice, Peter Stanning, Mr. Prowse, Mrs. Hartnell, the delivery boy from Ashton's, and several villagers whose names were less familiar. "I notice young Peter is marked as unaccounted for, between 2 and 3, Miss Marple remarked. Hayward nodded. "His mother says he was home, but there's a gap of nearly half an hour. And he's jumpy as a colt." Then there's Mr. Prowse, seen near the churchyard about the same time. He claims he was on a business call, but no one remembers seeing him until the raffle. "And the stranger in the navy coat," Miss Marple said. "No one knows his name or purpose." Hayward frowned. "We've sent to London about the pawn ticket. If it's connected, perhaps it'll lead us somewhere." Miss Marple returned the list. "My instinct tells me, Sergeant, that we're all a little too quick to look for scandal. The vicar's troubles may have been less about enemies and more about burdens, financial or otherwise." Hayward grunted but made a note. "If you remember anything else, let us know." As Miss Marple left the library, she passed Peter in the hallway, clutching a book. He avoided her gaze, but she noted the tension in his shoulders, the way his thumb rubbed at a frayed cuff. She caught a glimpse of something, guilt, perhaps, or fear. On her way out, Miss Marple paused in the vicarage's vestibule. A small pile of post waited to be sorted, bills, circulars, and a plain envelope with the parish's crest. She fingered it thoughtfully. Sometimes, she reflected, the greatest mysteries began with the smallest oversight. Back in the heart of the village, word of the satchel spread quickly. Mrs. Bartlett and Mrs. Vickers, their heads together at the greengrocer's, drew up a list of their own suspects, revising it with every new rumor. Mrs. Hartnell began locking her doors at dusk. Even Mr. Calthorpe, normally so jolly, seemed subdued as he delivered potatoes. Late that evening, as the sun set in a blaze of gold, a fresh commotion broke the uneasy calm. A child, looking for her lost ball near the lich gate, stumbled across a muddy handkerchief, white linen, with a faded blue border. She ran to her mother, who ran to the constable, and soon Sergeant Hayward had it in hand. No initials, no blood, but a curious scent of lavender water. Miss Marple, summoned for her opinion, turned the handkerchief over. A woman's, she mused. Someone who cares for her things. And recently washed, see the pressed crease? Mrs. Southwell, when shown the handkerchief, burst into tears. It's mine. I must have dropped it when I was searching the grounds that evening. Lionel always carried one for me when I was unwell. The finding of the handkerchief seemed trivial to some, but to Miss Marple, it was another thread. She pieced together the path Mrs. Southwell must have taken, and the timing of her discovery. If the handkerchief had lain there since that evening, had anyone else passed that way, or had the area been avoided, deliberately? As night gathered over St. Mary Mead, the villagers locked their doors and whispered their fears to each other. The vicar was still missing, but now the evidence seemed to point inward, toward the heart of the village itself and the secrets its people kept. Miss Marple sat at her window, watching the lights wink out one by one. She felt the tension building, a web drawn tight, just waiting for someone to tug at the right thread. Somewhere, she was certain, the truth was beginning to stir. Chapter 5. Miss Marple's Final Test. The days since the vicar's disappearance had stretched thin over St. Mary Mead, fraying nerves and unraveling the peaceful threads that once bound the village together. Rumors had become hushed accusations, glances turned wary, and even the familiar rhythms of church bells and market carts sounded different, like the ticking of a clock counting down to an inevitable revelation. Miss Marple, as ever, remained a quiet observer amid the shifting tide. Yet beneath her gentle demeanor, her mind worked steadily, weaving together the strands of what she had seen, heard, and sensed. She understood that the heart of any mystery lay not just in facts, but in the hidden emotions and subtle reactions of those involved. One by one, she began her discreet inquiries, engaging suspects in casual conversation designed less to uncover overt confessions and more to watch their responses, the quick flicker of an eye, a slight stiffening of posture, the hesitation before a word. Her first visit was to Alice Bertram. The young woman's pale face was etched with worry, but she greeted Miss Marple with quiet gratitude. "Do you mind if I ask you something, Alice?" Miss Marple began gently, settling herself by the window where the afternoon light softened her features. "Of course, Miss Marple," Alice replied, folding her hands tightly in her lap. "You mentioned before that the stranger at the gate spoke in a low voice and had ink-stained hands. Did you notice anything else? Perhaps something about his manner or his eyes?" Alice hesitated, then nodded. "He was polite, but there was something restless about him. He kept looking over his shoulder, as if afraid someone was following." "And did he say why he wanted to see the vicar?" "No, only that it was urgent. He seemed desperate." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Urgency can mean many things. Did you see him leave?" "No, I was distracted. I don't even know what happened to him afterward." Miss Marple's eyes lingered on Alice's face. "Sometimes, when we're frightened, we forget what we see. Or we tell ourselves what we wish to remember." Alice looked away, biting her lip. Later, Miss Marple called on Peter Stanning. The boy greeted her with a nervous glance, his fingers twitching as he shuffled papers on the small desk. "Peter, I've been thinking about the book you lost, the one Reverend Southwell helped you with. Is it possible it contains something more than poetry? A note, perhaps? Or a message?" Peter's eyes widened. I don't know, Miss Marple. It was just Greek verse. But, now I think about it, there was a folded sheet tucked inside. I never read it properly. I thought it was a study aid. Would you mind showing it to me? Peter hesitated, then nodded. Together they searched the scattered pages, eventually finding a small, folded scrap of paper with hastily scrawled writing in a neat but hurried hand. Miss Marple recognized some of the words as Latin phrases, but the meaning was obscure. Do you recall where you found this? She asked softly. Between the pages of the book, Peter answered. I'm sorry I didn't tell anyone. Miss Marple shook her head. No need to apologize, Peter. Sometimes, the truth hides where we least expect it. Her final visit of the day was to Mr. Prowse, the solicitor. His house was neat and cold, the air heavy with unspoken tension. He greeted her with polite reserve. Mr. Prowse, I'd like to speak about the letter you received, the one you showed to Reverend Southwell. He stiffened. I don't see what good that will do. It was a private matter. Miss Marple's voice remained steady. Yet you showed it to the vicar, and shortly after he disappeared. Might there be a connection? Prowse sighed, his defenses faltering. The letter was vague, threatening in tone. I was to meet an anonymous party at the hour. I assumed it was a blackmailer, someone threatening to expose irregularities in the parish accounts. And the vicar's attitude? He was troubled but determined to face it. I believe he wanted to protect the parish, keep its reputation intact. Miss Marple nodded, noting the flicker of unease beneath his composed exterior. Did you mention this to anyone else? No. Only you and, reluctantly, the police. As she prepared to leave, Miss Marple paused at the door. Mr. Prowse, sometimes the best way to discover the truth is to observe what people do, not just what they say. Outside, the village was settling into twilight. Miss Marple's mind traced the web of connections. A fearful stranger, a hidden message in a boy's schoolbook, an anxious solicitor, and a vicar burdened by secrets. Each thread wove a pattern more complex than any one piece suggested. That evening, Miss Marple invited Mrs. Southwell for tea. They sat by the fire, the room heavy with silence and the scent of jasmine from a nearby pot plant. Jane, Miss Marple began carefully, using the vicar's wife's first name to soften the moment. If your husband were here now, what would you most want to tell him? Mrs. Southwell's eyes glistened. I would ask why he didn't tell me the truth, that he was struggling, that he feared for us. And if you could say something to the person who might have taken him, or hurt him? A shudder passed through Mrs. Southwell. I would beg them to remember that Lionel was a man of faith, of kindness. That whatever he did, he was not evil. Miss Marple's gaze softened. Sometimes, the people closest to us carry the heaviest burdens, burdens they believe must never be shared. As the night deepened, Miss Marple sat alone by her window, her fingers resting lightly on the button she kept safely in her reticule. The mystery was far from solved, but the pieces were falling into place. She knew the coming days would bring confrontation, revelations, and perhaps justice. But for now, all she could do was wait and watch. The reveal. The tension in St. Mary Mead was now almost palpable. The village, once a haven of calm routines and neighborly pleasantries, had become a crucible of suspicion and unease. Every whispered conversation, every furtive glance, seemed laden with hidden meaning. Even the church bells, which once summoned comfort and community, now tolled with an ominous weight. Miss Marple had watched all of this unfold with her usual quiet patience, but inside, her thoughts churned with the intricate patterns she had been weaving together since the vicar's disappearance. It was time, she decided, to draw out the truth. She began by inviting the key figures to the vicarage drawing room: Mrs. Southwell, Alice Bertram, Peter Stanning, and Mr. Prowse. The room, heavy with polished wood and old books, was suffused with the soft glow of the afternoon light filtering through lace curtains. Miss Marple sat calmly, folding her hands in her lap. "Thank you all for coming," she began. "I believe we are close to understanding what happened to Reverend Southwell. But first, we must untangle a few knots." Her gaze swept the room, meeting each face in turn. Mrs. Southwell's eyes were red but steady, Alice looked pale and nervous. Peter shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Mr. Prowse's posture was stiff, his fingers tapping a restless rhythm on his knee. "Mrs. Southwell," Miss Marple said gently, "you mentioned that your husband was troubled by parish finances and worried about scandal. Could you tell us more about this?" Mrs. Southwell nodded. Lionel believed someone was mismanaging funds, perhaps even stealing. He spoke to me in whispers about trying to protect the church and its reputation. "And Mr. Prowse," Miss Marple continued, turning her attention to the solicitor, "you received a letter warning of a meeting. You showed it to the vicar. Did you suspect the sender?" Prowse swallowed hard. "I did not know who it was, but I feared blackmail. I thought it related to parish money, perhaps a disgruntled parishioner or someone with a grievance." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "And Peter, you found a note hidden in your Greek poetry book. Did you recognize the handwriting?" Peter shook his head. "No, but it was written in Latin. It mentioned truth hidden beneath the cloak of faith." "I don't understand it." Miss Marple glanced at Alice. "And you, dear, the stranger at the gate with ink-stained hands, did you learn anything else about him?" Alice hesitated. "No, but I remembered that Lionel mentioned receiving visits from a man who worked in London, an auditor or inspector, I think. They argued about the parish accounts." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Indeed. It seems our mystery has threads both near and far." She stood and moved to the desk, producing the pawn ticket, the one for the gold watch, and the torn, blood-stained handkerchief found near the yew hedge. "These," she said, "are pieces of a puzzle. The watch was pawned not by the vicar, but by someone desperate to cover losses and silence suspicion." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. "The bloodied handkerchief suggests a struggle, or at least distress. The footprints, the satchel abandoned, they all tell a story of concealment and fear." Miss Marple turned to Peter. "You have worried about the missing book and the note it contained. But more telling is your behavior the day of the fete. You were anxious, defensive. Care to explain?" Peter's face flushed. "I didn't want to worry anyone. But yes, I did argue with the vicar about the accounts. I was frightened he might find out I'd been careless in my duties as treasurer of the youth group." Alice gasped softly. Mrs. Southwell frowned. "Peter, how could you?" Peter's eyes filled with tears. "It wasn't like that. I made a mistake, yes, but I never meant to hurt anyone. I was going to tell him." Miss Marple raised a calming hand. "Thank you, Peter. Truth is the first step to resolution." She turned to Mr. Prowse. "You have been anxious, Mr. Prowse? Yet it seems you two had secrets." The solicitor's face paled. "Yes. I feared the parish funds had been misused. I confronted Lionel, but he insisted all was in order. I began to doubt him, but I never imagined that he might vanish," Miss Marple finished. "No, Mr. Prowse, the truth is more complicated." She moved toward the window, looking out at the village beyond. The vicar was burdened by more than finances. He was protecting someone, and in doing so, he became vulnerable. The room was silent, the only sound the ticking of the clock. Miss Marple faced them again. The stranger with ink-stained hands was an auditor from London, sent to examine the parish accounts. He and the vicar argued fiercely. When the auditor threatened to expose irregularities, the vicar vanished, not out of fear but to buy time, to protect the village and those he cared for. She smiled gently. "But one truth remains. Secrets can only be kept so long, and when they are uncovered, the impact is felt far beyond the initial act." Mrs. Southwell's shoulders sagged. "Lionel was trying to protect us all." Miss Marple nodded. "Indeed. And it is now our duty to honor that by seeking the full truth." Peter looked relieved, Alice hopeful, and even Mr. Prowse seemed to relax. The mystery was unraveling, but its resolution demanded courage and compassion. As the village held its breath, Miss Marple knew the hardest part was yet to come, the final reckoning that would bring peace or fracture the fragile harmony of St. Mary Mead forever. Chapter 6. A Meeting with Charles Foster. The next morning dawned cool and gray, with a mist clinging to the hedgerows and softening the edges of St. Mary Mead's familiar lanes. The village stirred reluctantly from its uneasy slumber, the shadows of the vicar's disappearance still stretching long over its cottages and gardens. Miss Marple, wrapped in her usual shawl and carrying a small notebook, made her way along the lane toward the outskirts where Charles Foster was said to be lodging. The man's name had caused a ripple of unease in the village ever since Sergeant Hayward had mentioned him. A figure from the past, whispered about in cautionary tales, yet real and now very much part of their present. The farmhouse where Foster was staying was modest, nestled among gnarled apple trees that bore the marks of an unkind spring. A gate creaked as Miss Marple pushed it open, and she was greeted by a young woman who introduced herself as Mrs. Kendall, the farmer's wife. "Mr. Foster's in the barn," she said cautiously, glancing behind her as if to gauge Miss Marple's intent. "He's a hard man, but fair enough if you're not here to cause trouble." "Only here to talk," Miss Marple assured her softly. "I'm sure he'll appreciate that." She followed the woman along a narrow path lined with wildflowers and nettles until they reached the barn's wide wooden doors. Inside, the scent of hay and earth mingled with something harsher, leather, oil, and a faint trace of smoke. There, sitting on a battered crate, was Charles Foster. He was a man weathered by hard years, his face tanned and lined, eyes sharp and wary beneath a mop of untidy dark hair streaked with gray. He looked up as Miss Marple approached, a flicker of suspicion in his gaze. "You Jane Marple?" he asked gruffly. "I am," she replied, offering a gentle smile. "I hear you've recently been in St. Mary Mead, and that you once possessed a gold watch belonging to the Reverend Southwell." Foster's lips twitched, not quite a smile. "Aye, that watch has been around my neck for a bit. I borrowed it from the vicar. Needed a bit of cash to keep food on the table." Miss Marple seated herself on a nearby bale of straw, folding her hands. "Would you mind telling me how you came to pawn it? And why you didn't return it sooner?" Foster sighed, running a calloused hand through his hair. "Trouble's a slippery thing, Miss Marple. I didn't mean no harm. Lionel was good to me, trusted me more than I deserved. But the money dried up, debts piled high. When the pawnshop man offered a few pounds for the watch, I took it. I meant to pay him back." "And did you tell Reverend Southwell about this?" "Not at first. I was ashamed. But then the fate came and things got complicated." Miss Marple leaned forward. "Complicated how?" Foster's eyes darted to the barn door, as if weighing whether to speak. Finally, he said, "There was talk of parish money missing. Lionel was worried, but he didn't want scandal. Said it'd break the village's heart. I told him I'd help make things right." Miss Marple nodded. "And did you?" "Did my best, but some folks don't want the truth unearthed. When the vicar disappeared, I thought it best to keep out of sight." Silence fell between them, thick but not uncomfortable. Miss Marple studied the man carefully. There was honesty in his voice, but also shadows, things left unsaid. "Mr. Foster," she said gently, "did you see or hear anything unusual the day Reverend Southwell vanished? Any strangers, arguments, or threats?" Foster's jaw tightened. "There was a man, one I hadn't seen before. He came to the vicarage, pressed Lionel hard about money and accounts. Said he was from London. Made Lionel nervous. Do you know who he was? Only that he had ink on his fingers, and his voice was cold. After that visit, Lionel was different. Kept checking his watch, pacing." Miss Marple's mind raced. The stranger Alice had seen, the auditor's threats, the mounting pressures. "Thank you, Mr. Foster. Your honesty helps bring light to this mystery." He nodded, eyes wary but resigned. "I hope the vicar's safe. For all our sakes." Back in the village, news of Miss Marple's meeting spread quickly. The villagers gathered once more in the square, some hopeful, others anxious. Peter, standing, appeared among them, looking less burdened than before. He had returned the found Greek book to the vicarage, along with the folded note, now partially deciphered. He shared what he'd learned. The note contained a plea for discretion, hinting at financial irregularities and a hidden burden Lionel had carried alone. Mrs. Southwell, despite her exhaustion, spoke of her husband's love for the village and his unwillingness to let scandal destroy what he had worked so hard to build. Miss Marple, watching all this from a distance, knew the truth was drawing closer. The puzzle pieces were aligning, revealing a portrait of a man caught between duty and desperation. But questions remained, questions that only a final confrontation would answer. That evening, as dusk settled, Miss Marple sat by her window. The village lay quiet beneath a blanket of stars, but in her heart, she felt the stirrings of resolution. The vicar's lost hour was no longer lost, it was waiting to be found. Threads unravel. The morning light filtered softly through the curtains of Miss Marple's cottage, painting delicate patterns across the worn carpet. Though the village stirred awake beyond her window, inside, Miss Marple sat quietly, hands folded, contemplating the shifting tapestry of St. Mary Mead's unfolding mystery. The pieces were slowly but surely aligning, yet a shadow of uncertainty lingered, one that demanded care and patience. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. It was Peter Stanning, looking more composed than she had seen him in days. His usual nervousness had yielded to a quiet resolve. "Miss Marple," he began, voice steady, "I've been thinking about the note in the Greek book. I managed to have it translated fully, and there's a passage that puzzles me." She gestured to the small table by the window. "Please sit. Tell me what it says." Peter unfolded the worn slip of paper carefully. It speaks of a shadow in the ledger, and warns that not all who bear the cloth can bear the burden alone. It's cryptic, but I think it's a plea, a confession. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. A confession hidden in plain sight. It seems Reverend Southwell carried more than parish duties on his shoulders. As they spoke, a knock came from the garden gate. Miss Marple rose to open it, revealing Alice Bertram. Her face was pale, but her eyes held a new steadiness. "I wanted to tell you something," Alice said quietly. "Yesterday, while tidying the vicarage study, I found a hidden compartment in one of the drawers. Inside was a small bundle of letters, correspondence between the vicar and an unknown correspondent." Peter and Miss Marple exchanged glances. Alice continued. They spoke of worries about the parish's financial records and threats from an outsider. The vicar wrote that he feared the consequences but refused to let the village suffer. Miss Marple's eyes sparkled with interest. "May I see them?" Alice handed over the neatly tied letters. Miss Marple's fingers brushed the paper reverently as she untied the string and began reading. The letters were careful, deliberate, but laced with urgency and fear. They mentioned audits, blackmail, and pleas for secrecy. The correspondent urged caution and hinted at plans to resolve matters quietly. "This changes everything," Peter murmured. The vicar wasn't simply hiding debts. He was protecting someone, perhaps the village itself. Miss Marple smiled gently. And perhaps himself. Later that day, Miss Marple arranged to meet Mr. Prowse at his office. The solicitor greeted her with a tired smile and a hint of apprehension. "I've been reviewing parish records and the letters you found," she began. "There's a pattern here. Someone was siphoning funds, but the reasons are unclear." Prowse sighed. "I feared as much. Lionel's attempts to conceal the problem were noble but doomed. The strain must have been unbearable." "Do you suspect anyone in particular?" Prowse hesitated. "There have been whispers about the church warden, Mr. Merrick. He has access to the accounts and opportunity." Miss Marple nodded. Opportunity and motive often go hand in hand. They discussed quietly how best to proceed without unsettling the village further. That evening, Miss Marple walked the village lanes, pondering the delicate balance between justice and mercy. She paused by the churchyard, where the yew tree cast long shadows, and whispered a silent prayer for guidance. She knew the next steps must be taken carefully, for the truth could heal or shatter, depending on how it was revealed. As she returned home, a soft light glowed in the vicarage window. Mrs. Southwell sat by the fire, her hands folded and face serene, as if accepting the uncertain path ahead. Miss Marple smiled softly, her heart steady with the knowledge that though the vicar's hour had been lost, the village's resilience was stronger still. Chapter 7. Approaching the Truth. The days stretched longer as St. Mary Mead's restless heart beat unevenly. The village, cloaked in the soft hues of late summer, bore the marks of its ordeal, the subtle shift in glances exchanged between neighbors, the cautious politeness at the grocer's, the hesitant nods along the lanes. It was as though the very air held its breath, waiting for the story to be completed. Miss Marple, quietly vigilant, had spent the morning reviewing the correspondence found by Alice. The letters, ink faded but their urgency clear, painted a picture of a man caught between his conscience and his duty. The vicar had tried to shield his flock from disgrace, but the burden had grown too heavy. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. It was Sergeant Hayward, with a report in hand. "We've spoken to Mr. Merrick, Miss Marple," he said. "The churchwarden denies any wrongdoing, but there are discrepancies in the accounts he manages. Enough to warrant further investigation." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "It seems opportunity and motive are aligning." Hayward hesitated. "There's also the matter of the vicarage garden. We found traces of recent disturbance near the yew hedge, signs that someone tried to conceal something." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Secrets have a way of revealing themselves, Sergeant." Later that afternoon, Miss Marple visited Mrs. Southwell. The vicar's wife greeted her with a weary smile, as if glad for companionship amid the uncertainty. "Jane," Miss Marple said softly, "how are you holding up?" Mrs. Southwell sighed. "The village has been kind, but the nights are long. I find myself recalling every word Lionel said in these last weeks, his hopes and fears." Miss Marple reached out, taking her hand. "Sometimes, sharing memories can lighten the heart." Their conversation was interrupted by Alice's arrival. Her face was resolute, no longer the timid girl of days past. "I found something else in the study," Alice said, producing a small notebook bound in worn leather. "It's Lionel's journal. He wrote often, but recently the entries became more troubled." Miss Marple opened the journal carefully. The pages revealed a man wrestling with dilemmas of faith, finance, and loyalty. The final entry was a cryptic plea: "If I should be lost, let the truth protect those who cannot protect themselves." That evening, Miss Marple convened a small gathering at the vicarage. Mrs. Southwell, Peter Stanning, Alice Bertram, and Mr. Prowse were present. The atmosphere was solemn but tinged with hope. "I believe," Miss Marple began, "that the vicar's disappearance was not an escape, but a sacrifice. He sought to shield the village and his loved ones from pain." She laid out the evidence: the letters, the journal, the financial irregularities, and the mysterious visitor from London. Peter looked downcast. "I wish I had been braver, more honest." Alice spoke softly. "We all have parts to play, and sometimes we learn too late." Mr. Prowse, the solicitor, sighed. "The truth will come to light, and we must face it with courage." Miss Marple's eyes met each in turn. "The next steps are difficult but necessary. Only by confronting our fears can the village heal." In the following days, the investigation deepened. Mr. Merrick was questioned extensively, and evidence emerged that suggested he had diverted funds to cover personal debts. The village reeled at the betrayal, but also rallied around those hurt. Miss Marple's discreet inquiries uncovered that the vicar had been planning to reveal the truth at the fete but was stopped by threats from unknown sources. The discovery brought a mixture of relief and sorrow. Lionel Southwell had carried a secret burden to protect others, a burden that ultimately cost him dearly. One late afternoon, as the sun dipped low, Miss Marple walked the lanes alone. The village was quiet, the shadows lengthening. She paused beneath the yew tree in the churchyard, reflecting on the fragile strength of human nature. St. Mary Mead had endured pain, yet its heart remained steadfast. Secrets had been unearthed, justice begun, and in the gentle unfolding of truth, the village would find its way forward. Miss Marple smiled to herself, knowing that, while mysteries might never truly end, neither did hope. The resolution and reflections. The village of St. Mary Mead awoke to a morning tinged with the clarity that follows a long, restless night. The weight of uncertainty, the creeping suspicion, and the whispered fears that had hung heavy over the community began to lift, replaced by a quiet determination to rebuild and to reconcile. Miss Marple stood by her window, watching as familiar figures moved along the lanes, some with tentative smiles, others with faces lined by the strains of recent days. She held the small navy button she had found weeks ago, turning it thoughtfully between her fingers. That tiny piece of cloth had become a symbol of the tangled web of human frailty and strength she had seen woven through the village. The events that had unfolded in St. Mary Mead were far from simple. The disappearance of Reverend Lionel Southwell had been the catalyst, but beneath it lay a complex tangle of secrets, sacrifices, and flawed humanity. At the vicarage, a gathering had been arranged, a community meeting called to address the revelations and to chart a path forward. The hall was filled with familiar faces, parishioners, villagers, friends, and neighbors. The atmosphere was solemn but resolute. Mrs. Southwell, now steadier and supported by friends, stood to speak. Her voice was soft but clear. Lionel was a man who loved this village deeply. He bore burdens we could scarcely imagine, and though he vanished from our sight, his heart never left us. She paused, gathering strength. The truth that has come to light about the parish accounts is painful, but it is also a beginning, a chance for St. Mary Mead to heal with honesty and grace. Miss Marple watched the assembly, her gaze warm but discerning. She saw the relief mingled with sorrow, the tentative forgiveness extended toward those who had faltered, and the quiet resolve to build anew. Peter Stanning, once so burdened by guilt, stood to offer a heartfelt apology and a promise to learn from his mistakes. Alice Bertram spoke with newfound confidence, reminding all that courage often arose from the humblest places. Even Mr. Merrick, the churchwarden whose misdeeds had come to light, faced the assembly with a measured remorse. As the meeting drew to a close, Miss Marple stepped forward. Her voice, though gentle, carried the weight of wisdom earned through years of observing human nature. My dear friends, the events we have lived through remind us that we are all imperfect. We carry secrets, we make mistakes, and sometimes we are called to great sacrifice. She smiled kindly. But in the end, it is love and truth that sustain us. Reverend Southwell's lost hour was not just a mystery, it was a testament to the complexities of the human heart and the resilience of community. The villagers nodded, some with tears, others with quiet smiles. That evening, as twilight softened the sky, Miss Marple sat in her cottage with a cup of tea and the soft hum of the village settling into peace. She reflected on the journey, the vanished vicar, the shadowy threats, the hidden letters, the tangled motives, and the fragile threads of trust and betrayal. In St. Mary Mead, life would go on, marked now by the understanding that even the smallest place held stories as deep and varied as the human soul. Miss Marple smiled to herself, knowing that mysteries might never fully end, but neither did hope, kindness, and the enduring power of community. With that comforting thought, she prepared for bed, the village quiet outside, wrapped in the gentle embrace of a new dawn.